Good evening and welcome to the Past Presidents of WLAM interview with WLAM. I'm Christina Billowas, and this is my ultimate pleasure to host tonight Julia Darlow, trailblazer and legend of WLAM and the State Bar. The date is March 16th, 2021, and I'd like to introduce the conversation to Ms. Julia Darlow. Thank you for being here today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Christina.
We thought we'd get started with some of the questions, just introducing you to WLAM and the State Bar. How did you happen to get involved with WLAM?
My most specific memory, and I've been trying to remember, we're going back to the early 1970s right now, so it's a bit of a stretch, but I believe I started practicing in 1971 in Detroit, and somebody told me I'm thinking it was around 1972 or 73, about a breakfast that the Women Lawyers Association gave. And I believe it was an annual breakfast where judges were invited. And I remember going to that breakfast, and it was it was kind of formal, a little bit stiff, as I remembered. And I thought, well, I don't think this is exactly for me. And then within a not too long a period of time, I met a group of women who were becoming active in women lawyers, who wanted to really put life and movement into the organization. As you know, it was founded in the 1918, wasn't it? Or the founding of women lawyers. And I think it had gone into kind of a quiet period right about during the 60s, very early 70s. But these women whom I met, who were all new lawyers, pretty much like myself, they had so much enthusiasm and so many ideas that had never entered my head, about what we could do and what we could be, and what Women Lawyers Association could do. I was just absolutely taken with the people, these women and their ideas, and ultimately with their friendship. And that, I think, was somewhere in 1972, early 1973. And I got very involved, and we all worked together on a whole lot of things that I hope I could tell you about. But so it was one very quiet, proper kind of ladies' lunch type breakfast, saying, I don't think so. And then all of a sudden meeting these wonderful women that really changed my life in so many ways. So that was the beginning.
That sounds really amazing, because I think there's often those two different groups. There's some where you're feeling not quite at home and being yourself, and then when you find you've really arrived with the group you connect with. I definitely would love to hear more about that and your evolution into leadership with WLAM. And then the second part, you had mentioned that it come from a quiet period of time, and that's what kind of research had been telling me when we were working on the historical committee. Would you be able to tell me a little bit about your time in leadership and as you rose to become president of WLAM?
Well, yes. This group of women, and many of whom also became president of WLAM during the years of the 70s, or were officers or otherwise active, or became heads of other bar associations as women, and usually the first ones of various bar associations, which I love to mention. But it was really, it's hard to know where to start. We got started very quickly. Somehow it was just one of those very happy set of circumstances. These women had really focused on the fact that there were virtually no women judges in the state. And an early focus was one, to work to make women judges, help make women judges in the state of Michigan, and two, to change the thinking of all the men judges out there about whether or not there should be women judges, and also whether there should be women's rights, because that was quite a big issue at the time. 72, I think, was the Equal Rights Amendment was sort of bursting forth and gaining support. And there were a whole lot of changes going on about the way women thought about themselves. And there were hardly any of us who were lawyers at that time. So we were all sort of saying, well, how do we do this? So we got very active very quickly. And I believe that the first project I remember that went on for years was our political action committee or political advisory committee. I forget what we called it, but we set about interviewing candidates for judges. And I'm pretty sure we were doing that by 1973, 74. And it was really thought of by us as a teaching opportunity, that we got to teach all the candidates things that we would hope that they would understand better about how women are treated in the law, what issues there were. Another thing that was going on was the Criminal Sexual Misconduct Act was enacted during that period. And of course, that was, the rape laws in those days were unbelievably difficult for women. I imagine you know that. And, women were more often presumed guilty of inviting the rape than they were ever seen as victims. And that Criminal Sexual Conduct Act that was passed during that period of time was a huge change. Let's see, we worked a lot on supporting each other. We were in different areas of practice, most of us. I was one of the very few, perhaps for a while, the only corporate lawyer. I was with a traditional firm. A number were with the city, some were with plaintiffs in plaintiffs' attorneys' offices. But we had such common experiences. We were all helping each other try and navigate this new territory that we were in. So pretty soon we got into organizing the Women Lawyers Association, but I would say that really started probably 75 or so. I'm giving you a whole lot of information, so please tell me where I should focus on.
No, this is great. I'm just kind of seeing the whole story taking place and shaping. So please continue.
Well, it is a long time ago, but some of these women had the most amazing courage, and I cannot claim that for myself. If I have courage, I learned it from them, and they were forever challenging the very conventional ideas that I and some of the rest of us had in the most constructive way. I don't mean it in a negative way at all, but just assumptions that we had to act in a certain way, and they would say, "And why are you acting that way? Don't you want to say directly what you're thinking or what you mean?" That type of conversation that for young women, relatively young women, I wasn't that young actually, to find their way to become effective lawyers. This kind of interchange was invaluable. Let's see. So the judicial candidacy interviews were very helpful. Another thing that was helpful was we became active in a sense in politics. We lied a lot about how many of us there were, and we represented, I remember, not big lies, little lies about how many lawyers there were, but we would talk about our organization a lot to the political people that were there. And I can't go very far without mentioning that there were some wonderful politicians in Michigan in those days, and one of them was the governor, Bill Milliken. And he was so responsive to us. I found some statistics that were published in 1984 about where women had come from and where they had gotten to. And there were, just a handful of judges really around Michigan who were women at that time. And Milliken appointed a whole bunch of us as judges. And it wasn't partisan at all. It was the qualified people. One of my favorites was a woman who became a very well recognized judge, whose name was Clarice Jobes, and she was very active. Do you know her name through the history at all?
Yes.
Women lawyers. Well, Clarice was a very I'm going to say colorful personality, strong spoken, and stuff. And she was very active in the Human Rights Party, which was probably what we would call, not far left, but certainly definitely left, and definitely not a Republican as Bill Milliken was. And I remember he appointed her a judge, I believe a recorder's court in Detroit, the criminal court at the time. And the celebration that we had over that appointment was just very, very special. We always said that when we got a woman appointed as a judge and we went to her swearing in, it was taking the place of going to weddings, which had been going on. And, it was kind of like, it was that kind of celebration, though. It was really fun. So we had a lot of good times, I would say, and a lot of really constructive times. And as I said, a lot of the group were becoming active and getting positions in other bar associations. I don't have really the chronology in my head that clearly anymore, but for example, Carol Champ, who's very well known, I think even today, as a lawyer, she became the first woman president of the Detroit Bar Association somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm not sure where. I mentioned to you Fran Evidenka, who became president of the Oakland County Bar, first woman president of the Oakland County Bar, and Artie Lancaster, the Genesee County Bar. What others? There are others that I'm not thinking of, but so there was progress going on all kind of across the board. Notwithstanding the fact, I think when in the early 70s, about 3% of the lawyers in Michigan were women. And I think by the early 80s, it was around 7%, something like that. So, but women were doing a lot. A couple of things I should mention, very major focus. I mentioned the sexual assault legislation. Domestic violence was something that we were becoming very, very aware of at the time. And it's hard to imagine now the thinking that was fairly prevalent among otherwise very good thinking people, that women who were victims of domestic violence must have been asking for it. That was, a prevalent point of view that we were trying to change. And for example, when we interviewed candidates for judges, we would ask them questions about that, and we would take positions on legislation. And we also formed a political campaign fund that wasn't part of the association, but very closely allied with it. I think that was in the late 70s. That's the problem, is I'm giving you a big span of time of what we were working on, but that became very important for some period of time. And it was to support women candidates for all kinds of public office, not just judicial, and also men who were supportive of women. That was the idea there. And when did Ferraro run? 79 or so. The first woman vice president. It was around that time that we were particularly active, both in women lawyers and in political action work, where many of us were just wearing the different hats, but doing work for both organizations. I think the one other major undertaking that we had in the 70s, it was certainly well, there are two others, sorry. One in the 70s, and especially when I was president, 77, 78, hopefully I'm right on that. We were trying to organize women lawyers, not just as getting more members and interacting, but into the regions. We didn't have regions at that time. And that was a huge effort. Both, it had two motivations. One, we wanted the women that were in Grand Rapids, the women lawyers in Grand Rapids or Lansing or whatever, we wanted to help if we could them to get together, because many of them didn't really have much contact. There, of course, there weren't that many of them. I remember in the days before computers, God knows, I was sitting in my living room couch at home, handwriting out the lists of all the women lawyers in the state and where they were, and contacting them. We literally, it was that my daughter always remembers that. It was that kind of primitive, but we did want them to know that there was women lawyers, and that the organization had been around since the beginning of the time of the suffragettes, and all of that, and that we could help maybe with a framework. And what we envisioned was what I think you still have today, which is the local women lawyers units, if you will, or with their own separate governing organizations, but then with sending the board members to the central organization, and the central organization working when it was statewide. The work was statewide. I think that's still your organization, isn't it, today?
It is. We have our regional representatives from each of our respective regions, and they get sent to WLAM State Board and then report back to the regions, essentially as a liaison between state affairs and the regional events.
Well, we worked hard on that during the 70s, and I'm thinking that 77, 78 were the years that we really focused on that. And literally a couple of us, Carol Champ and I made any number of trips around the state, and it was really fun. I remember we went to Kalamazoo to talk to women there. There were 7 women there, and they didn't really know each other. And we went to some woman's lovely house and sat in front of her fireplace and had the best time. That one is really clear. But I know we went to Grand Rapids and the Western, I think we called it the Western region at that time. And there was a good group of women already there. I mean, by that, I mean like maybe 15 or something.
And they are still a great group of women in the Western region.
Absolutely. Yeah. And very tough-minded. They challenged everything we did, but I think it was great. We went to Flint. There was a Flint region. I remember going to Lansing, and we just went and we talked about what we'd been doing in the Detroit area, and Ann Arbor too. And of course, Ann Arbor was, as today, very proud of its liberal traditions, and they were very positive. They were amazing, but also very argumentative. It wasn't democratic enough. Remember that. I mean, but it was really fun, and I think very constructive. And there was a real sense of trust. I mean, the organization was very much, I think, full of a sense that we trusted each other and we could rely on each other. And that was a wonderful thing. I'd never had that really with an organization before. And certainly been with some wonderful organizations since, but I think the combination that we were new, we were trying new things, we were, I guess, didn't know what mistakes we were capable of making yet, all that kind of stuff. But it was a very wonderful experience. So I think I've cut. Oh, the other thing was the Women in the Law Conference. I did want to talk about that. And I had mentioned to you, I thought I had materials from them. I found the brochure from the 1976 Women in the Law Conference. I believe the first one was in 1975, and I don't have materials from that, although I was involved in working on that. I think that's the one that Justice Ginsburg came to. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything on that. I have pictures and other things from the 76 one. Was it the 75 conference that she came to? I think you had mentioned it to me.
I believe so. I don't know for sure on the date. I'll make sure that I do confirm that. I'll let you know, because we do have the documents and we had mentioned that during the centennial.
Yeah, right. Well, and we had talked about it a little bit, and right. I thought I had photos and a program from that to be sure, but that was the very first one. And the two that I was involved in that one quite a bit, but I think the Trial Lawyers Association, Michigan Trial Lawyers Association, they really at that time, they were wonderful about it. They did most of the heavy lifting for that first conference, and a number of us were very involved and sat on the committee and things like that. But the second one, I think women lawyers did most of the heavy lifting, and that's the one that I have a lot of materials for. One of the things that was fun there is that we honored all the women judges in Michigan. If you have the program, you would probably see that. But I did locate some photographs from that period. And of course, we invited the Chief Justice of Michigan Supreme Court, which was Thomas Giles Kavanaugh at the time. And he came and made a speech. He'd never spoken to I know that he had never spoken to a group of feminist women like that. And he was a little bit in awe of all of us, but he did a great job, and it was really fun. There weren't that many women judges, and we had them all at this big head table. It was really great. But I think the programming was very strong at that conference. I remember how hard a lot of our members worked, and how honest and forthright they were about the challenges of practicing and how they overcame them. And so it was great for all of us. We all learned tremendously from it. And then all the newer lawyers, by that time, we were veterans of 5 years or so as practicing lawyers. I think it was a good thing. And it was one of the very first, I think, in the country. There weren't too many at that time. There have been a few others, but it was still kind of a breakthrough kind of thing. So it was great. So
that sounds amazing. And I do have a follow-up question concerning the Women's Law Conference, but something you said previously really struck me, and I'm taking some written notes too. Challenging convention in a constructive way. That's such a powerful statement, and it kind of lends itself, I think, to a question that during this time too, there must have been some challenges. And to your recollection, what were some of the challenges that you faced during your administration, kind of keeping in this framework of also challenging convention, but in a constructive way?
Well, I'll tell you a story that I particularly loved. It's funny, I think. I mean, it certainly was funny to us. It was when we were doing one of those interviews of judicial candidates, and the gentleman, we asked it was a gentleman, what his opinion of the Equal Rights Amendment was. And he looked up and he said, "I haven't finished reading it yet."
That's a safe lawyer response there with a bunch of women in the room.
It was like 2 sentences. So we very politely read it to him. And he said, "Well, that sounds pretty reasonable to him." And we said, "Good, we were cool about it. And I don't think we laughed there. I hope not."
He was a smart man after all, so there we go.
Anyway, but that was just fun. I mean, we knew that was true, that a lot of people were just not paying any kind of attention to it. Gosh, challenges. It's funny. It's probably memory, putting rosy hues over everything, but I don't remember unhappy challenges in any sense through Women Lawyers Association. I'm sure we had, problems and things, but it was a constructive organization. I mean, we were helping each other solve problems of how do women become strong lawyers? How do we become true voices in the legal community? How do we make things better for other women? And I will say one thing, we weren't into a whole lot of career secret type stuff. We did talk about our challenges at work. We definitely shared the challenges we had at work, and we talked about different ways that we could deal with them. And of course, all of us had very significant challenges, one sort or another. And but it was in the interest of learning how to deal with them. So it was very positive when we were able to talk to each other. And even though we were in, as I mentioned earlier, very different kinds of practice, we found that the common elements of the problems, well, there were many common elements among the problems and challenges we had. I don't recall the organization ever facing any kind of setback type challenges. We did have when we did the reorganization, I was serious. There were heavy debates about how democratic we should be. And we had it wasn't a hierarchical structure, but it definitely was representational, and that some people were much more wanting, one person, one voice in every venue. But those are good debates, those were not problems. I will say there was some tension. There was in those days with feminism, I think there were some people that were sort of bitter type about what the situation was, and were inclined to be anti-men. I don't know how else to say that. And that was okay. It was a point of view. I don't think most of us were. Our goals were to change how people perceived women and their problems. I do know that all of us wanted to help other women. I think that was maybe part of the glue of the organization. That was, we weren't there weren't enough people climbing ladders to be real focused on how well we were climbing our respective ladders. More getting by was, day to day than going up any ladders. But there was less of the professional grooming type stuff, if you know what I mean, that became the focus of a lot of organizations later, I think. I don't mean to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I do think that the priorities in that group, in the Women Lawyers Association in those days, the priorities really, really were other women and the status of women in society, the well-being of women in society. Equal pay, for example, equal pay for equal work was not accepted by many people. You wouldn't believe the arguments that people had of why it was okay to have unequal pay, but there were lots of them out there. And so we were fighting, really solid walls. It was, you knew what you were up against. Sometimes it gets more confusing, I think, but in those days, the prejudice was, and the prejudicial thinking and the concepts that were out there, once you really looked at them, they were indefensible, and you had to go for them. It wasn't like we were arguing over what was right and what was wrong, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It does, and it sounds like as a group, you had to have solidarity, so the challenges weren't of an internal nature. You all work together for the common goals and the perception of empowering women in the profession. But perhaps then it sounds like some of the challenges were some of the prejudice and outside forces that you were seeking to overcome as an organization.
I think so. And I would say that our priority was other women outside the profession. We were obviously working for ourselves. When I say we sat down and we talked about the problems we had and all that was very, very beneficial. But I think any one of us would have said the purpose of the organization is to help other women. That, there was that sense, and it was a very meaningful, I would say it was very important to me. I'd never had something like that I really felt was so important. And I learned how important it was through the eyes of the women I worked with. They saw a whole lot more than I did at the beginning, that's for sure. So.
No, that sounds fantastic. And thank you for sharing those examples. Is there anything that you knew after your leadership at this time that you wish you had known going into it? kind of like the lessons learned, hindsight 2020 effect, if you will?
I'm sure there was at the time. I can't, it's not anything that's in my mind today. I'm sure there had to
Sure.
have been, things that I'm sure I didn't say well, or I don't know, maybe, all of those things that you hold for a while, but eventually they kind of go. But my feeling about those years and the working with the other women is really very, very positive. I don't have any sense of regrets about what we were doing, or how we were, and really, no, it's a very happy memory that I have.
No, and you can't beat that, to be able to have that and that kind of impact on society during those pivotal times, is phenomenal. What would you say, if you can think back on, was there a significant achievement or series of achievements that you are most proud of during that time? I know we touched on all these pivotal moments in history, but during your administration.
Well, I think problem is I can't put everything. I don't think of it in terms of my administration. During that period, we were getting together all the time, and doing different things together all the time. So I don't have a sense of my term started, and so I was doing a lot more or a lot less. Um, there is one thing I want to say about that, so I'm not misleading, because some very important things did happen to me during that time because I was president. And I do want to say that, talk about that. But in terms of pivotal events, I mean, we definitely wanted that statewide organization, and we were working very hard for that. And as I said, Carol and I and Pam Harwood and some of the others that were so active, I think we were very convinced that it was a good thing, and we were happy that it came together. And so I think we were proud of that. I think we were proud of the conferences, that probably exceptionally proud of the women judges who got appointed or elected. A number of them got elected too during that period. So I think those would be the main, other than helping each other, which I think we did. I think those are the successes. Looking back, I would call those the successes, or the most important things that I remember. What I did want to tell you, though, because one of the really important things in my life, deriving from the fact that I was president of Women Lawyers, was that I became involved, because I had that role, in several other things that became very important to my career, including the state bar. That was really fundamental, and that was at the time, the State Bar Board of Commissioners, the governing body of the State Bar of Michigan. I don't know if this is still true, but the Michigan Supreme Court made several appointments to the Board of Commissioners. They were the appointees of the justices, and Mary Coleman, who was our first Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, and an absolutely wonderful, beautiful woman from Battle Creek. And she barely knew me. She knew I was president of Women Lawyers. She reached down, and she was the person instrumental in my becoming appointed to the State Bar Board of Commissioners, which I can't remember if it was that year or the next year or whatever, but we knew each other through Women Lawyers, and she knew me because I wore that hat at the time, and I had the opportunity to meet her and things like that. And that was, some of the judges, like Justice Coleman, were not walking around wearing signs, "I'm a feminist" or anything, but they did so much that people don't really know, things like that. Another example of that, I think, was a little bit later, but Judge Kennedy, who was then, what was it? There were just a handful of women federal judges in the country, just a handful. And was and still is this annual meeting of a certain groups of lawyers that deal with the federal courts a lot and the federal judges, the Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference. And the way that lawyers would go would be that they would be invited as, I don't know, I think we're called delegates or something like that, of the federal judges. And Justice Kennedy reached out to me. I was really pretty young for that honor. It was a huge honor, and invited me to be one of her delegates to the Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference. And it was right in those years. And again, I knew her through women lawyers, and that's, and that was, both of those things were huge, huge, huge gifts. I mean, that's how you can call them, huge gifts to me. And they also were ways, because I stayed very involved with women lawyers during that period of time, that women lawyers, I think, became more integrated in the, along with the work of all of the local bar association presidents I mentioned. But we were just integrating during that period more and more throughout the existing structure. And I will tell you, for example, with considerable, not inconsiderable enthusiasm from my women lawyer friends, that not my very first, maybe my second meeting at the State Bar Board of Commissioners, I asked the State Bar to endorse the Equal Rights Amendment.
Excellent. Way to be a champion, right? Getting involved with the BOC, just taking charge. I love it.
Well, it was controversial. It was not like it passed. And in those days, the State Bar could. Now, since then, there have been limitations on political positions. And I suppose that was political, sort of, they probably couldn't make that kind of an endorsement today. But back then, I proposed it at one meeting, and the next meeting, lots of debate. I was scared out of my mind, I have to tell you, with all these older, distinguished, frowning men sitting around the table. And but they passed it. It was not unanimous, but they passed it. So the bar, and that was, the women lawyers, believe me, they were holding my hand as I, tried to do that, and as it worked. So, and there were lots of other things like that. That by then we were into the early 80s. Well, I'm okay in that period, but it was very well, how should I say? I always felt that I had one hand holding onto people in the State Bar group and one hand holding on to people in the women lawyers group. It was never, I left one for the other or something.
And you're building upon those connections. It sounds like WLAM was almost the catalyst for your future success as well. Obviously, it was you who did all these things for yourself and the betterment, but that was the group, that nucleus of the support of all those women that moved forward too.
Absolutely, no question about it. Yeah, it was hugely supportive, and things I would never, when I started my career, I never would have dreamed of. So,
continuing on about your journey into the State Bar presidency, tell us a little bit just about that. And I know you said WLAM played a big role in that. I don't know if you were still involved with WLAM at that point, but why don't you tell us a little bit about that part of the journey?
Well, and again, my chronology, without really digging into boxes, which I don't even think I have anymore, but is a little blurred. But I think I was a member of WLAM's board into the early 80s, and I was a member of the State Bar Board of Commissioners in the early 80s. So there was definite overlap there. The other things, though, jumping forward, when I became president of the State Bar, I know that I wasn't at that point going to meetings or things like that, but some of the things that I did were definitely tied to women lawyers. I, certainly going to meetings, meeting with women lawyers all over the state, as well as bar associations, where women would come. Uh, it was kind of a celebration. Sometimes it was really, really very nice. And certainly going to the presidency, and then we can maybe work back a little bit. But as I think about it, one of the things I was very intent on doing when I became president was appoint women as chairs of state bar committees. That was, there were very few at the time, and every place I could, I appointed women. One of the things that we did when I was president at the state bar level was create the Senior Justice Committee. And although that would sound gender neutral, it really isn't, because so many of the women, so many of the people who are seniors who needed help and were not getting it in our society were women. And that was also advanced by women lawyers, not the association that I remember, but a significant group of women lawyers that wanted the Senior Justice Committee to be established. So we did establish that. It's by that time, women's issues and women's rights were sort of basic to thinking about what all these different things in the legal profession. There's one thing to get to, but leading up to that, one of my colleagues on the Board of Commissioners, also appointed by this Supreme Court justices after I was Marianne Batani, who you probably know now as a federal judge, but became a state judge after that. And she and I were serving along with several other wonderful women who were appointed. The justices were doing a pretty good job with Mary Coleman up there after me. And I think there were, Barbara McKenzie and Sharon Levine from Kalamazoo. We were all on together. I might be missing somebody, I probably am. But we were all women lawyers people. And Marianne had been president of Women Lawyers as well. And we used to drive, because we lived fairly close to each other. We would drive to Lansing for all these state bar meetings together, and I won't say plot, but certainly strategize. So everything that women lawyers stood for, I think we took with us to the state bar, and that it was kind of an ever-present thinking, if that makes sense. The other thing that I think was probably one of the most important things, if not in my mind, the most important thing that came out of the state bar work was, while I was still a president, and actually even a little bit before the state bar, Pam Harwood, again, later became a judge, was very active in women lawyers, and she had the idea, which I certainly joined her with, but it was her idea, that we needed to have a task force on gender issues in the courts, and that the Supreme Court should appoint a task force, and also one on race issues in the court. And so all during the time that I was president, Pam and I were lobbying then Chief Justice G. Minnan Williams to appoint this task force. And he finally did it after my term was over as state bar president. But the task force started up not too long after that. And he made me chair of that. And Judge Hood was chair of the race task force. And we worked for 2 years, having hearings around the state. Do you know the task force report? Is that something you're familiar with?
Yes.
It was, we really documented things like I was mentioning earlier, of judges thinking that women invited domestic violence, that type of prejudice. We had hearings where with the public was invited in to talk about their experiences in the court. We met with judges. We did all kinds of research. Lorraine Weber was our executive director. And I don't know if you know of Lorraine, but there's no harder worker in the world. And she had a staff. So it was a huge project. Gosh, I can't remember how many findings we came out with, but it was really looking at all of the problems still very, very prevalent in the courts involving gender bias. And there was a lot of it. And what I think out of that, the good news was, and very sadly, the bad news was that G. Menon Williams died just as we were finishing our work. And he was the heart and soul of that at the Supreme Court. The task force recommendations to the court never went all that far. And that's not just, that's been written about. But the state bar, and under the direction then of Michael Frank, who was a wonderful executive director, the state bar implemented everything it possibly could get its hands on in our report. I think that's made a difference. And the education of judges that the state bar put together as a result of that report really did take place, and I think made a big difference. So you can trace all of that right back to 1973, when we women were getting together. As I said, Pam Harwood, who worked with me with women lawyers in the 70s, was the one pushing. We're going to go see Chief Justice Williams today, Julia. So we got to keep at him. We got to get him to do it. I mean, she was the person that was the guiding spirit on that, and I was her very willing participant because it was a really important project. So that's why it's hard for me to sort of break it into segments.
No need for the chronology. It's helpful to get that picture. But what's to me so poignant are these examples, and these are relationships of helping along the way. The women lawyers with the Board of Commissioners to the state bar, kind of hand in glove, those relationships. Yeah. I have to ask though, especially as it was in the 80s when we had, which to me is astonishing that it was so long that it took us to have a female leader at the state bar. What was it like being the first female president of the State Bar of Michigan?
Well, I got more credit than I deserved. Well, let me mention one other thing. Justice Archer, Mayor Dennis Archer, he was Dennis Archer. He was state bar president a couple years before me. And one of the things he did, he was the first African-American president. And by the way, Mike Frank, who was the executive director of the state bar, whom I mentioned a minute ago, he was one of the most fair, open-minded, progressive guys you're ever going to meet. And he was a guiding light as well for people like Dennis and myself and other presidents of the state bar at that time. And he wanted us to be out there doing good things. What Dennis had done, and he was my role model in this, he had gone all over the state and met with people, the Upper Peninsula, Western Michigan, Central Michigan, all over. And I wanted to do that too. And I, years later, when I was campaigning for election myself to a position, I remember going to the Upper Peninsula to campaign and hearing about when Dennis Archer had come up there as state bar president. And Dennis did more, I think, for opening the minds of Michigan lawyers on his personal visits. And I tried to do the same, and it was a great joy. I mean, people were really nice, and it was wonderful fun. I've ever since then, I've just loved going around Michigan because I saw places I never would have gone, small communities, and again, all over the Upper Peninsula and to, little towns in northern Michigan, the border towns on the east and the west side of the state, closest to the borders. And so that was it could be exhausting, I have to say, but it was really it was fun, and people were glad and grateful that you came, and so that was fun too. um we boy, I hope I'm not sounding like such a rosy memoried idiot, but I
No, I
yeah.
think these are some of the best and heartfelt memories, is that if you're able to tie it back to all these individuals to help better the community that helped your journey moving forward, I find this super meaningful and beneficial, and I think our membership will as well.
Oh, good. Well, I hope so. I will tell you where, I guess I think I have to be careful with this a little bit. Um, oh, another thing that helped, though, I should say, it really helped me with my clients, by the way, to be state bar president, because they were impressed, and that was very nice. And I was in a, very competitive law firm, so that was a good thing. It didn't particularly help me with my law firm, I will say that. And that was one of the choices I made. Um, but that was not the best part of the whole thing, although there were many supportive people there. But overall, uh, you know, law firms were going through lots of changes in the 80s as well. When I joined the firm I was with, I thought it was huge. There were 50 lawyers, you know, and today I don't know how many there are at that firm, but firms are huge and you don't
Right.
know everybody, but you did, and there was a lot of change going on, and I think, but one that did have a good result in the end, because I really did learn that I needed to build my own clientele and my own practice, and that turned out to be very beneficial for me, even though it wasn't a lot of fun at the time sometimes. If that makes sense. So
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think women, sometimes I think that the hardest places for us women in the law, I'm wondering if it isn't even true today, is, in your own home ground. It's the world is sometimes more ready to accept you than, the guy next door. So anyway,
So well said.
yeah. But that I don't remember.
No, that sounds incredible. Like, to have those experiences both geographically and then the relationships you've established as well. Like, what a time that was, and to be so pivotal, not just for women in the law, but for the state bar being our first female president. That's amazing.
Well, it was wonderful to go to groups of women. And I remember one woman, I think it was Ann Arbor actually, she said, "How on earth did you do that?" It really was unusual at the time. And the good news that I could say to people was, it wasn't, I got a lot of help, and it wasn't that hard. It was much more rewarding than it cost. Far more rewarding than any cost that I paid for it. Far more.
That's beautiful. Would you say that, and I know your leadership experience have changed over the years, and it wasn't maybe going to the meetings with WLAM on an ongoing basis once you had moved into other roles of
Right.
leadership, but did you continue your relationships with women in WLAM over the course of time?
Yes. I now let's see. Well, there are some women that I consider my best friends, period, today, and no question about that. And now I'm 79, so it's what would be true for me today is different than maybe 10 years ago or so. Um, but gosh, I meet people even today, and we remember what we've done together, what we did together, and it's a great feeling. Yeah, definitely. In fact, I was at a Zoom meeting today on a board that I'm on, and another woman came on the board today, who's, I would guess, good 20 years younger than I am, but I knew her through, I wouldn't say necessarily women lawyers, but the fact that we were all in there working together one way or another. We knew each other, and there's so many women like that around.
It doesn't have to be directly affiliated with the organization. It's that
Exactly.
heartfelt and that spirit and those connections. I think that's what it's really about, celebrating women in the profession, and then even outside the profession, lifting each other up.
I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, very much so. And it was that kind of camaraderie that other women were having, I think, throughout the 70s and the early 80s, in many different areas. And we kind of feel it with each other, I think, when we encounter each other today. So, yeah.
I've got 2 remaining questions because I do want to be cognizant of the time. This has been an
It's
incredible
fine.
experience. This has been very inspirational. The first question, are what are any hopes or ideas that you would like to see for WLAM as WLAM moves into the future?
Oh, well, it has been quite a long time now since I've been involved with WLAM, and I don't know much about what you're doing. I think it's such a rich, complex time today. It was kind of simple when we were women working together, and now it's so clear that we all need to understand all of each other so much better than we ever did, and that we haven't done a great job of that. And the whole anti-racism movement is so compelling. I'm even forgetting your question because I was thinking
No, it was just about
change
goals for the future for women in the profession, WLAM. And I already am taking some handwritten notes because I thought that was profound, understanding each other better than ever before, and during the such rich, complex times that we're living in.
Really, it really is about respecting each individual at core. And I see a lot of progress towards that. I see some amazing books being written. Some of the literature today is, it's like worlds you haven't really seen before, and eye-opening. It's an eye-opening time. And of course, even our gender notions are changing so fundamentally today, that when I think it's fascinating. I haven't really thought about that before. When we call ourselves women lawyers, can that mean what it should today? Because it should mean that we're open to everybody. But is it exclusionary? I don't know.
And we're not exclusionary.
I
by
know
any
you're not.
means.
No, and I was just thinking about that. No, I just hadn't thought about it before, and I apologize. I should have. I should be thinking about that, but I do think that what I would like to see, to get back to your question, is this just working so that we all do understand and respect each other, whatever our identities are. And I think that was fundamental back in the 70s. And oh, I have to tell you about Ann Davidow before we stop, because she was there in the 70s, and I can't talk about women lawyers without talking about her. But I think finding ways to understand each other and show it and mean it, and build back some trust on that basis that is, I think, threatened today in many ways. I'm not doing a very good job of putting that into words, but that's kind of if I were going to say, what's the direction? I'd spend more time trying to figure out what I'm trying to say, I guess.
I think it was well said too, about the understanding, the trust, and the respect. It doesn't get more deeper or nuanced than that, and just qualities of humanity. So super well
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me mention to you Ann Davidow, because if
Please.
as you know that she was one of the original members of Women Lawyers. Did you know about her? Have you heard about her?
One of the 5 ardent Portias, or subsequently
She was
thereafter?
she was in that initial group. I don't know if she's one of the 5, but she was a brand new lawyer in the Detroit area at that time. And when we started, my friends and I getting involved, as more and more involved with women lawyers, she was there with us, and she was in her 80s at the time, and she was such an inspiration. I mean, we basically had no idea about what the suffrage movement was all about or what women had gone through in those days. And there she was all these years leading us on, being our biggest moral support. So I did want to mention that in the early 70s, we had that connection right back to the beginning,
Okay.
in terms of this wonderful, quiet, gentle little woman that joined us all the time. And she was just a joy to us. So I didn't want to leave her out of the story.
No, thank you for sharing about her. And the only question that I really have remaining is, what advice do you have for future leaders of women in the law? What wisdom can we take to our next generation of leadership?
Gosh, I don't want to presume. I'm not sure. I think, well, I think find your own courage. It may not look like the courage of everybody else, but you got it. So find it. If you don't already, trust your own courage. Let me put it that way. That's a better way to put it. Trust your own courage, and reach out to people.
Thank you. I have to say, this has been such an amazing experience. It's been humbling and an honor. It's been humbling because there's so much that you've taught me, and I'm sure to our constituents who listen to this. And it's been such an honor to speak with you. Don't go away. I'm going to just stop the recording so we have this for posterity, and then I'll talk to you for a couple of minutes. This has been an incredible experience. Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you.